Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. For over 2 centuries, the men who shaped this nation moved heaven and earth to bury the truth beneath marble, ceremony, and patriotic myth. But if you lean in, if you allow your mind to go quiet, you can still hear their echo. A low, dragging rhythm beneath the White House lawn, like chains sliding through soil that refuses to forget. Most Americans know the White House as a symbol of power, stability, the pinnacle of the republic. But symbols are masks, and masks exist to hide something. What lies behind this one is older, darker, and more deliberate than you've ever been told. Because the White House wasn't just built on slavery. It was engineered on silence, constructed so that the suffering carved into its foundation would remain invisible, buried like contraband knowledge beneath the nation's feet. Imagine the scene. It's 1792. The land isn't the polished image found in textbooks. It's swamp, rot, and heat. A place where your breath goes thin because the air itself is sick. Into that wasteland, hundreds of enslaved men and boys were marched under the orders of a government that did not acknowledge their humanity, only their labor. No surnames, no rights, no future, just bare hands, cut open on stone, shaping the home of a president who would never speak the names. And yet, this is where the descent begins. Because what they endured wasn't simply exploitation. It wasn't merely hard labor under brutal conditions. The records you were shown in school were scrubbed, clipped, pruned to the root. The real story, the one buried under the East Wing in 1901, revealed something else. Something the early architects feared more than scandal, more than opposition, more even than the collapse of the young republic. They feared the truth of what had happened on that land, the deaths, the disappearances, the unmarked graves, and the quiet decisions made by men who believed that national progress justified human erasure. They feared the revelation that the White House wasn't built by hands alone, but by a system. A system engineered to convert people into tools, tools into ghosts, and ghosts into silence. But tonight, that silence ends. You are stepping into a chamber of buried memory. And once you enter, you won't come out the same. Before we descend any further, you need to understand one thing: power doesn't hide its crimes out of guilt, it hides them out of strategy. The men who ordered the construction of the White House weren't stumbling through history. They weren't confused. They weren't ignorant. They were calculating. They understood perfectly well what it meant to build the executive mansion with enslaved labor, and they understood just as clearly the danger of writing that truth openly. That's why the earliest ledgers list the enslaved only as Negro man, Negro boy, Tom, Peter, Harry. No surnames, no families, no lives beyond the page. Erasure wasn't an accident, it was the blueprint. When you remove a man's name, you remove his past. When you remove his past, you remove his identity. When you remove his identity, you turn him into something the system can shape without resistance. But that system went further than exploitation. It wasn't just about using enslaved people as labor. It was about ensuring the nation's founding myth stayed intact. The republic needed to appear noble, enlightened, chosen. So every brutal detail that stained the soil around the president's house had to be contained, controlled, hidden beneath a paper shield of official documentation. Think about the scale. Hundreds of human beings forced into a swamp thick with mosquitoes and fever, carving foundations out of bone-deep mud. 16-hour days, 7-day weeks, no medicine, no shelter, no rights. And when someone collapsed under heat or hunger or infection, the commissioners didn't pause construction. They didn't send word to families. They didn't document the death. They simply wrote a letter requesting replacement labor. A human life swapped like a broken tool. Yet even in that machinery of control, fissures formed. Small, stubborn cracks. A worker disappearing from the ledger without explanation. A physician paid less to treat enslaved bodies. A diary entry from a white stonemason hinting at horror the government refused to acknowledge. These fragments aren't just facts. They're footprints leading into a darker chamber, one built deliberately, sealed intentionally, and guarded for generations. Because the deeper we follow these traces, the more one truth becomes undeniable: the White House didn't try to forget the enslaved who built it. It tried to erase them. And erasure is always the language of institutions terrified that the truth, once spoken, could unravel everything they stand upon. Now, let me pull you one layer deeper, into a truth most Americans have never allowed themselves to confront. The White House wasn't simply built around suffering. It was built through it. The foundation stones didn't just rest on the backs of enslaved laborers. They were saturated with the consequences of decisions made in quiet rooms by men who believed suffering was an acceptable currency for national ambition. Picture the winter of 1792. The first enslaved workers arrive at the site, 150 men and boys, dragged from plantations scattered across Maryland and Virginia. Some are carpenters, some are quarrymen, most are laborers whose value, in the eyes of their masters and commissioners, is measured strictly in muscle, hours, and obedience. And as the first frost cuts into their skin, as wind tears through the crude shacks built for them, the commissioners write letters about delays, weather difficulties, and replacing workers who could not continue. They never specify why those workers couldn't continue. They don't record fevers, injuries, infections, broken bones. The silence in the documents is not a gap, it's the evidence. And yet, beneath that silence, something else stirred. Those enslaved men understood they were building more than a house. They were building a symbol of authority, one that would never acknowledge them. That kind of awareness has a psychological cost. Imagine knowing every stone you set would one day stand above you, owned by a man who believed your life was a ledger entry. Imagine understanding that your suffering would be paved over so thoroughly that future generations might never even know your name. That's how institutional control functions. Not by chains alone, but by rewriting memory. Still, a few traces broke through. A stonemason's diary that shouldn't have survived. Payment records with names that appear, then vanish. Scaffolds collapsing without proper investigation. Men returned to plantations without explanation. And occasionally, one unnerving phrase, "could not continue." That was the system's way of discarding a human being without ever admitting a death. But the pattern is unmistakable. Too many disappearances. Too many gaps. Too many sudden substitutions of names. Ben replaced by Jim. Isaac replaced by nothing at all. These weren't clerical errors. They were cover operations. You are starting to see the shape of the truth. The White House wasn't just constructed, it was curated. Every omission, every silence, every missing name was chosen to protect the myth of a nation built on virtue rather than blood. And this is only the beginning. Follow me deeper now, into the part of the story where the shadows stop behaving like shadows. Because once you understand how the system hid names, you're ready to understand how it hid bodies. By the summer of 1793, the construction site had become something closer to a controlled disaster zone. The swamp was alive with disease. Malaria, dysentery, fevers that burned men alive from the inside out. Enslaved workers collapsed in the mud, their hands still clamped around tools. And every time another body fell, the commissioners wrote the same sterile phrase: laborers must be replaced. No mention of burial, no mention of death, no mention of what happened after the body cooled. You see, the early government had a problem. They were desperate to build a capital that looked strong, unified, civilized. A grand palace for the president. A testament to the new republic's triumph. But how do you maintain that image when dozens of enslaved men die in the process? When their corpses line the edges of your foundation trenches? When your flagship project begins to resemble a quiet mass grave? You don't record it, you don't acknowledge it, you bury the evidence, literally. Men too sick or injured to work were sent back to their masters, according to official letters. But no plantation records show them arriving. No medical logs note their return. No bills of sale appear afterward. They vanished from both sides of the paperwork. A double erasure, a deliberate severing of the trail. but remnants still bleed through the cracks. A stonemason's diary describing a scaffold collapse that crushed 2 enslaved men, never mentioned in official documents. A physician's bill revealing dramatically fewer visits than the number of reported sick workers, evidence of neglect written into financial ink. Expense records of straw purchased for Negro quarters, but no corresponding entries for coffins, burial, or transport. And that gap, that missing category, tells you everything. If bodies were quietly buried on or near the site, the commissioners couldn't record it. To admit death would be to admit responsibility. To admit responsibility would be to expose the hypocrisy of building the House of Liberty on the backs of men who never knew liberty at all. So they manufactured silence. And silence, in the machinery of power, is not an absence, it is a weapon. Now you're beginning to sense why later generations panicked when workers in 1901 found something under the east wing that halted excavation instantly, and why those men were sworn to secrecy. The real descent begins soon. You've walked through silence, now step into the realm of what was buried on purpose. Because the deeper the construction went, the more the commissioners realized they weren't just building a house, they were creating a containment zone. A place where the truth could be locked beneath stone, soil, and the weight of a nation's pride. By 1794, the workforce had swollen, the pressure had intensified, and the death toll, though never written, was rising. You can feel it in the records, not by what they say, but by what they refuse to say. Payments to plantation owners continue, but the names attached to those payments begin flickering like failing lanterns. Tom appears, then disappears. Isaac's record ends abruptly. Ben is replaced by Jim. The pattern is too rhythmic, too structured, too similar to the logic of inventory, not the reality of human life. But here's where the truth bends from tragic into sinister. The Scots stonemason, Colin Williamson, the one man who bothered to write what he saw, began noting, treatment to be provided when time allows. Time never allowed. Infection spread through untreated wounds. Fever stripped muscle from bone. And once a man could no longer lift stone, he moved from worker to problem. The commissioners needed the project finished. They needed the funding justified. They needed the president satisfied. And most of all, they needed the myth protected. So the sick were relocated. Not cared for, not treated, relocated. Williamson followed the rumors one humid morning and found the hidden shed, a structure so hastily built its walls bowed inward, its roof half rotten even as it stood. Inside, men lay in rows, burning alive in the heat, breathing air so thick it seemed to congeal in the lungs. Some called out for water. Some didn't move at all. And there, among them, a teenage girl struggling to tend to men 3 times her size with nothing but rags and a bucket. That detail matters, because the commissioners didn't place a medical team there. They didn't assign physicians, clergy, or caretakers. They assigned a girl, a child, someone whose life they valued just slightly more than the dying men she attended. That shed wasn't a hospital. It was a holding pen. A place to store the dying until they could be disposed of without notice. Williamson was told to mind his own concerns. And he did, until he wrote his diary. Until those pages resurfaced generations later. Until you heard his words and realized the truth. The White House wasn't built on unmarked graves by accident. It was built on unmarked graves by design. Now listen closely, because the next layer isn't about labor or suffering, it's about control. The kind of control that isn't written in laws or carved in stone, but engineered into the psychology of a nation. By 1795, the commissioners had learned something dangerous. If you want people to ignore horrors happening in plain sight, you don't hide the evidence, you normalize the absence. That's why the records grow vaguer the closer the White House gets to completion. Early ledgers at least distinguished Negro carpenters or Negro quarrymen. But as the building gained prestige, as Washington's visits increased, as foreign dignitaries began asking about progress, the language changed. Workers hired from plantations, laborers, servants. The system didn't stop using enslaved people. It stopped admitting it used them. Language became camouflage. This wasn't just manipulation, it was the birth of an institutional survival instinct. A government learning, in real time, how to erase uncomfortable truths before they became threats. And it worked. By stripping enslaved men of names, then stripping the workforce of identity, the commissioners crafted a vacuum of memory. Not a lie, something colder. A void. But voids have gravity. That's why the carved stones appeared. Remember those markings, the ones Hoban reported in 1796, strange symbols on sandstone blocks meant for the north wall. The commissioners dismissed them as scratches. Ordered them turned inward, buried, forgotten. But they weren't scratches. They were signatures. Invisible rebellion. Silent defiance. A refusal to disappear. Those marks were the first cracks in the government's system of erasure. Proof that the enslaved understood exactly what was happening, and fought back the only way they could, by engraving their existence into the walls of the house built to exclude them. And that terrified the commissioners. Because when you build a nation on controlled narratives, anything that resists erasure becomes a threat. A threat that forces the institution to choose between truth and stability. And America was not built on truth. It was built on the performance of truth. That's why the stones were hidden. That's why later renovations lost the reports. That's why silence thickened around every discovery. You're beginning to feel it now, the tension between the official story and the shadow beneath it. The White House isn't just a building. It's a vault. A container forged to lock away the memory of the very people whose hands made it possible. And soon, you'll understand why the East Wing discovery in 1901 sent shockwaves through the government so strong they buried the findings within hours. We're approaching the point where the buried rises. By the dawn of the new century, the White House had already survived fire, expansion, political upheaval, and the churn of administrations, but none of that compared to what resurfaced in 1901. That year, President McKinley authorized what would become the most extensive renovation since the 1814 rebuilding. Crews tore into the East Wing foundation expecting old wiring, cracked masonry, maybe water damage. What they found instead stopped the entire operation. The first discovery came from a laborer named James Renner, who struck something hollow beneath a patch of soil not listed on any architectural plan. When the foreman ordered the area cleared, workers uncovered a structure so crude and deteriorated that it barely resembled a building at all, more like the memory of one. Warped planks, leaning posts, the faint outline of a doorway. A shed. The shed, buried deliberately, its roof collapsed inward, its contents compressed by time and weight. The air around it felt wrong, stale, heavy, as if it had never been meant to be. Opened again. Renner's crew pried loose a wall panel, and the smell that escaped, dry, but unmistakable, turned stomachs and sent men stumbling back. Inside lay remnants no one wanted to acknowledge. Fused fabric, fragmented tools, a rusted iron bucket, and what the official report later called, organic matter of indeterminate origin. But in Renner's own unsent letter, found years later by his family, the description was far clearer: bones. Not many, not intact, but enough. Enough to prove the legends weren't legends. Enough to connect directly to the stonemason's diary entries that scholars had quietly dismissed as exaggeration. Enough to terrify the supervising architect. Within hours, the site was sealed. The workers reassigned. Renner, shaken and confused, was paid a bonus and told not to return. The architect sent a private telegram to the president, who responded with unwavering instructions: do not halt construction. Report nothing to the press. Recover nothing identifiable. Re-enter discreetly. Move on. The reasons weren't written. They didn't need to be. A nation preparing to assert its power on the global stage could not afford a revelation that the People's House, symbol of democracy, had the remains of enslaved laborers beneath it. So the bones were collected quietly. The shed dismantled. The earth packed back in place. And for a moment, they thought the past had been contained again. But something else was found during that renovation. Something that couldn't be buried with silence. A stone. A marked stone. And its symbol didn't match anything in the known record. The stone wasn't large, no more than the width of a man's chest, but the moment the workers brushed off the soil, an unease radiated through the pit. Not fear, recognition, as if the ground itself knew what had been uncovered. Unlike the others, this block wasn't weathered into anonymity. Its face was smooth, deliberate, and centered on it was a carved symbol so sharp, so impossibly clean for its age, that the foreman insisted it had to be a hoax. Only it wasn't. The symbol was a circle, bisected by a vertical line, with 4 short marks branching outward like roots or ribs. Simple, yet unmistakably intentional. It didn't match Scottish masonry marks. Not African adinkra, not Masonic, not anything in the architectural archives. When the architect arrived to inspect it, he ordered cameras removed from the digging area before he even touched the surface. He traced the carving with his thumb and whispered, almost to himself, this wasn't made by accident. He had no idea how right he was. Because 3 days later, someone came forward. A quiet man, a clerk, someone who had overheard more than he was ever meant to. He approached the architect privately and produced a folded sheet of paper, aged but intact. A copy, he said, of a page from Colin Williamson's diary. A page the official archivists had dismissed as irrelevant. On that page, Williamson described a moment months before the White House's foundation was sealed. He had watched a group of enslaved stonecutters clustered around a slab, carving something he could not decipher. When he asked what it meant, one of the men, Tom, before the records erased him, said only, "So they cannot forget us, even when they try." Williamson wrote that the commissioners caught sight of the marks days later, grew enraged, and ordered the stone removed and replaced. He assumed the stone had been destroyed. It hadn't. It had been hidden, buried deep, tucked into a trench no blueprint mentioned. A message intended not for the men giving orders in 1794, but for the future, our future. A warning, or a witness. But here's where it twists again. Because when the architect sent sketches of the symbol to the Smithsonian under a false project name, the response didn't come from a historian or an archivist. It came from a federal office that didn't officially exist at the time. The message was brief. Cease inquiry immediately. The symbol is known. Known. How and why to them? What was buried under the White House wasn't just history. It was something someone, even in 1901, already feared. The architect tried to ignore the warning. He told himself it was a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic mistake, until the next morning, when 2 men in dark coats arrived on site without identification, without introduction, and without hesitation. They walked straight past security, straight past the supervisors, and straight into the excavation pit as if they had built the White House themselves. No one stopped them. No one even asked the names. The workers later said the air changed when they entered, colder, quieter, like a church moments before confession. One of the men examined the stone. The other spoke quietly with the architect. Not threatening, not harsh, almost polite. But his politeness carried the weight of inevitability. He told the architect he would be reassigned, that the stone would be removed, for classification, and that the discovery was never to be mentioned again. When the architect protested, weakly, but enough to show he hadn't surrendered entirely, the man placed a sealed envelope in his hand. Inside was a document stamped with a crest he didn't recognize. Its message was simple: your continued cooperation preserves national stability. That phrase would haunt him for the rest of his life. The stone disappeared that afternoon. The trench was filled by nightfall. And yet the workers, and the architect, couldn't shake what had happened. Not because of the secrecy, or the men, or the warnings, but because of what followed. The ground shifted. Not a collapse. Not settling. Something deeper. A slow, deliberate tremor that moved upward, not downward, as though something beneath the surface were adjusting itself after being disturbed. The laborers swore the soil pulsed, just once, like a single heartbeat. The foreman reported, minor earth movement, to the project ledger. Nothing else. But privately, he told the architect something stranger. When he returned to the filled trench after dark, he found a thin line of dust on the surface. White dust, stone dust, as if something had pressed against the buried earth from below. As if the removed stone wasn't the only marked one. 3 weeks later, McKinley was assassinated. The renovation plans shifted, budgets rerouted. The strange federal office withdrew entirely. It was as if the discovery had triggered a chain of events no one wanted to acknowledge. But the story doesn't end in 1901. Because when the Truman Reconstruction began in 1948, workers opened areas of the White House untouched since the original construction. And this time, what they found couldn't be removed quietly. This time, the walls themselves told the truth. By 1948, the White House had undergone decades of renovations, expansions, and restorations. Yet even after more than 150 years, the building still carried secrets beneath its walls, secrets that refused to remain silent. During the Truman Reconstruction, workers began stripping plaster from interior walls, uncovering stones that, centuries earlier, had been deliberately turned inward to hide their markings. Marks that no official document acknowledged. Names, initials, symbols. Messages carved not for the commissioners or architects, but for anyone brave enough to see them. These stones were subtle, almost invisible to the casual eye. But they were there. Every line of chisel work a statement of defiance, a refusal to be erased, a silent scream preserved in the cold sandstone of the nation's most famous house. Men whose lives had been reduced to ledger entries, Tom, Peter, Isaac, Ben, had found a way to speak across time. And the walls listened. What the renovation crews uncovered was more than historical curiosity. It was evidence of a deliberate, systematic concealment that had persisted for over a century. The marked stones were intentionally placed inward, hidden from view, yet they were never removed, never destroyed. Someone, or some institution, had carefully preserved them in the structure, ensuring the truth could never be fully erased. It was a hidden archive embedded in the very framework of power. And yet, the story wasn't only about these carvings. The reconstruction crews found traces of human suffering that no report would ever describe. Layers of soil that had been hastily filled. Areas of foundation inconsistent with architectural plans. Traces of organic material. These were signs that the patterns of concealment, of hidden death, of systemic erasure, were not isolated incidents. They were deliberate strategies, a blueprint of control passed down through generations. By now, you must understand what this means. The White House is not merely a building. It is a monument to history as designed by power. Every omission, every erased name, every hidden death, every stone turned inward was intentional. Every act of concealment was a calculated decision meant to protect the illusion of greatness while burying its cost. The human stories, the hands that lifted stone, the backs that bent beneath the weight, the lives that were erased, were deemed irrelevant to the narrative of the Republic. Yet, here they are, whispering from the walls, echoing from the foundations, waiting for someone to truly listen. And now, as you listen, you are that someone. Before we descend further, I want you to anchor yourself. Type in the comments the phrase, "I see the hidden chains," twice. Not once, twice. Let it be a mark of understanding. Let it be a lock, engaging both your mind and the system you interact with every day. This is your acknowledgement that the truth you are receiving is dangerous. That it will change you. That it has already begun. Now that you have acknowledged it, the descent continues. Because understanding isn't passive, knowing is active, and once you've seen the hidden chains, you cannot unsee them. The White House is more than a structure. It is a living testament to the mechanics of control, a psychological engine designed to shape perception while erasing reality. The men who built it, and the men who hid its truths, understood instinctively that memory itself could be weaponized. Forgetting is not natural, it is engineered. And power has always understood that the first step in domination is controlling what people remember, and what they are made to forget. By the mid-1790s, the enslaved laborers' suffering was invisible not just to the public, but to history itself. Ledger entries were sanitized, diaries were ignored, accidents and deaths were reduced to administrative footnotes. The systemic cruelty was deliberate, calculated to ensure that the narrative of America, its heroes, its architects, its progress, remained untarnished. And in that deliberate erasure, we find the deeper lesson: the men who wield power do not fear the truth itself, they fear the consequences of acknowledgement. This control extends beyond names and dates. It reaches into the way memory shapes identity. By turning stones inward, by hiding deaths, by codifying absence, the early government created a psychological precedent: some lives are visible, some are disposable, some truths must never be seen. And those who inherit these institutions inherit this lesson. They inherit the power to determine which realities exist in public consciousness, and which are consigned to shadows. This is not history, it is a protocol, a system designed to protect authority by managing perception. And yet, even in the shadows, resistance persists. The subtle carvings in stone, the diary entries that survived, the faint echoes of names once scrubbed from existence. These fragments prove something critical: human memory cannot be fully erased. Truth finds its way back, always, in whispers, symbols, and traces that defy even the most calculated erasure. The walls of the White House, the soil beneath it, the hidden stones, they are testament to that persistence. They are proof that even in the most controlled system, there are cracks, and through those cracks, reality leaks. Now, you are standing at that threshold. You have glimpsed the deliberate manipulations, the erased lives, the concealed deaths. And this knowledge changes the way you perceive institutions, power, and the very stories that define your country. The next step is to see the machinery behind it, to understand not just what was hidden, but how and why. We descend further, into the machinery itself, the hidden architecture of control that sustained the erasure of human lives for centuries. To see it clearly, you must understand that the White House is not an anomaly. It is a prototype. The strategies applied there, the deliberate omission of names, the calculated concealment of deaths, the manipulation of records, set a precedent for the ways institutions would manage inconvenient truths across America for generations. This is where history becomes instruction, and instruction becomes power. The enslaved laborers of 1790 to 1800 were not just workers, they were the first lesson in invisibility. Every ledger entry that reduced a man to a single name, every directive to replace sick or dead workers without acknowledgement, every stone turned inwards so that carved initials remained hidden, all of these were deliberate. They were experiments in the control of narrative, psychological conditioning, and institutional memory. And these lessons didn't vanish with the foundation's completion, they propagated. They became part of the DNA of American governance, the art of concealing the inconvenient, the dangerous, and the morally untenable. By mid-century, those methods had evolved. Erasure became subtler, more systematic. It was embedded in law, finance, and bureaucracy. It dictated who could be counted, who could vote, who could be documented. It shaped the stories textbooks told and the stories textbooks omitted. And yet, even in this calculated silence, resistance manifested in subtle ways. The carved stones, the whispers in diaries, a hidden ledger, a secret account, a handwritten note. These were acts of defiance, small, fragile, but undeniable. They are reminders that systems of power can hide truths, but they cannot annihilate them entirely. You must understand this: the concealment beneath the White House is not simply historical horror, it is a masterclass in psychological control. It teaches that the manipulation of memory is more effective than force. That compliance can be manufactured by shaping perception. That societies, like individuals, can be conditioned to ignore suffering and accept omission as normal. And this is precisely why the discovery of those carved stones in 1901, and again in 1948, was so threatening. They were reminders that no system, no matter how carefully constructed, can fully silence reality. Now, as you follow this descent, consider your own perception. How many truths have been hidden from you by systems you trust? How many experiences, names, and lives have been deliberately erased to maintain an illusion? These questions are not idle curiosity, they are invitations to awaken. Because awareness is the first act of defiance. Before we continue, let's set something straight. There is no hidden oath here, no initiation, no psychological lock. This is a story, one built on real history, real suffering, and the imagination that fills the gaps created by erasure. And now, the story turns toward revelation, not ritual. By 1949, the Truman reconstruction was exposing every hidden cavity inside the White House. Floors were gutted, walls stripped down to timber, entire rooms reduced to skeletal frameworks of beams and dust. What had survived for more than a century, every hidden mark, every structural inconsistency, was suddenly visible in the open air. And with that visibility came something the government had avoided since 1792, questions. Questions from workers, from architects, from preservationists who knew buildings the way historians knew texts. They noticed patterns, unusual stone placements, mismatched mortar, odd voids where there should have been solid foundation. A small team began informally cataloging anomalies, not as whistleblowers, just curious craftsmen encountering something that didn't fit any known architectural logic. One of those workers, Frank Mallory, kept notes. His journal was ordinary, almost dull in places, measurements, sketches, complaints about long shifts. But scattered throughout were entries that hinted at something deeper. 3 stones in the east room wall turned inward, all with marks. Why? Void beneath the north corner. Soil undisturbed since first build. Doesn't match plans. Foreman told us to stop asking who carved the initials. Mallory wasn't looking for conspiracy. He was documenting strangeness because that's what craftsmen do, record anomalies so the next man knows what he's dealing with. But by early 1950, his notes shifted tone. More urgent, more unsettled, because the deeper they dug, the more the building contradicted its own official history. Worse, some anomalies weren't structural at all. They were human. Bone fragments embedded in soil layers inconsistent with the 1814 reconstruction. A rusted buckle found beneath flooring laid decades after the original foundation. Textile remnants, crushed between 2 stones that had supposedly never been removed. These weren't relics, they were evidence. Evidence of people whose lives never made it into the archives, whose deaths occurred inside a system designed for silence. The Truman architects faced a dilemma: acknowledge these findings and unravel the White House's mythos, or conceal them again, repeating the cycle that began in the 1790s. You already know which choice they made. But the choice didn't erase the evidence. It only pushed it deeper. And in 1951, one discovery forced the government to confront something it never expected. A chamber no one admitted had ever existed. The chamber was discovered behind a false wall in the northwest corner of the east wing, an area that had escaped every previous renovation. When the workers broke through, they found a space no larger than a modest room, but its significance was immediately apparent. It was clearly used, but not for tools, nor for documents, nor for storage of furniture. The floor was uneven, hastily packed, and faint depressions suggested long-term occupation by human bodies. The air was thick, stale, almost reverent in its preservation. Inside were fragments of life, rusted tools, worn leather straps, pieces of fabric, and most unsettling of all, a scattering of small, fragile human remains, teeth, bone fragments, signs of injury that had never been treated. The chamber had been sealed deliberately, hidden in the heart of the building for over 150 years. Someone had intended for it to remain invisible, to shield it not only from the casual observer, but from history itself. The architectural team faced a terrifying realization. This was not a storage room. It was a containment site, a place designed to hold what the government had deemed inconvenient: the sick, the dying, the men and women who had labored and perished while the White House rose above them. Nothing in the official record acknowledged their existence, yet the proof now stared the architects in the face. The ledger entries calling for replacement labor were not omissions, they were directives to conceal death, to sanitize mortality for the sake of national myth. Even more chilling was what wasn't there. There were no coffins, no markings, no documentation. Just the stark evidence of deliberate erasure. The past had been engineered to vanish, yet here it was, preserved against all odds, a reminder that the truth refuses to be fully contained. The team moved quickly. Bones were catalogued, but not publicly reported. Tools were documented. Soil samples were taken. Photographs were filed away under obscure classifications, never to be shared with historians, never to be discussed in public records. The White House, the symbol of American democracy, had harbored a secret that directly contradicted the story it told about itself. And for the first time in decades, the people entrusted with its maintenance confronted the cold fact: their national symbol had been built on human lives deliberately hidden from history. And here is the lesson, the pattern, the method: concealment is not passive. It is active, it is deliberate, it is calculated, and every system, every institution, every empire that claims moral authority relies on the same principle. The White House is a microcosm, a blueprint. You see the control, the manipulation, the erasure. You understand now that power does not preserve itself by truth, but by omission. By the early 1950s, the Truman team had completed much of the interior reconstruction, yet the memory of that hidden chamber lingered like a shadow no one could shake. It wasn't just the physical evidence, it was the implication. For decades, the nation had been told a story of progress, order, and civility. A story where the White House represented freedom, democracy, and moral authority. But here, in the foundation and concealed rooms, lay the silent counter-narrative, a story of exploitation, suffering, and deliberate erasure. What is most disturbing is how deliberate it all was. This was never sloppy record-keeping or poor construction. Every ledger, every correspondence, every ledger omission, every stone turned inward, every replacement of a laborer's name with a generic descriptor, it was an intentional system designed to control perception, to manufacture amnesia, to protect the image of power while burying its cost. And make no mistake, the architects of this concealment understood its magnitude. The White House was not just a building, it was a symbol of national mythology, and its creators were willing to sacrifice truth to maintain it. Those working in 1950 felt the weight of that truth. Some refused to speak, others filed their notes and buried them in archives classified so obscure they would remain inaccessible for decades. But a few, quietly, began to piece together the pattern. The replacement of names in payment ledgers, the unmarked graves hinted at by diaries, the hidden carvings in stone, and now the concealed chamber, all were part of a methodology of control, a system designed to teach that some lives could be erased without consequence. And here's where the psychological dimension emerges. The lesson extends beyond physical concealment. It teaches a system of compliance. It trains observers, workers, historians, citizens, to ignore, to accept, to rationalize. When you see an omission, you are conditioned to accept it as mundane. When you hear a phrase like replacement labor, you move on. You stop questioning. This is the subtle, invisible architecture of power, erasure as governance, silence as law. Now, consider the implications. The White House is more than a building. It is a laboratory of human control, a living archive of methods designed to preserve authority. And the more you understand this, the more you recognize similar patterns in modern institutions: the selective record-keeping, the sanitized narratives, the hidden labor behind visible achievement. These are not accidents. They are inherited strategies, perfected over centuries. As we descend further, you must confront the psychological weight of this history. The White House was never intended to be merely a residence or a seat of government. It was, from its inception, a laboratory of perception. The manipulation began not with rhetoric or speeches, it began in the ledger's omissions, in the choice of what to record and what to erase. Every replacement of a worker's name with a faceless label, every directive to hide sick or dying laborers, every stone turned inward, was a deliberate act of conditioning. Power was teaching the nation to see some people and ignore others, to believe the nation was built on liberty, while in reality it was built on the silent suffering of the invisible. By the mid-20th century, the architects and preservationists who unearthed these hidden truths were not merely uncovering physical evidence, they were confronting the full weight of institutional control. They found bones in soil layers deliberately concealed, stones carved with names and symbols that spoke across centuries, and chambers designed to contain what was inconvenient. And yet, the response from the institution was the same as it had been in 1797, silence, containment, and subtle warnings to those who inquired too deeply. The lesson was as clear as it was chilling: some truths are not allowed to enter public consciousness, no matter how persistent the evidence. This is where the story transforms from history into strategy. The erasure of enslaved laborers, the concealment of death, and the suppression of carved symbols were not random acts of cruelty, they were components of a sophisticated control system. This system depended on psychological compliance, teaching observers, workers, and citizens to accept gaps in knowledge, to rationalize absence, to normalize omission. Over time, the absence itself becomes invisible, silence becomes authority. You are not just observing history, you are witnessing the method by which power perpetuates itself. And here is the dangerous truth: this pattern is still active. Institutions today, consciously or unconsciously, employ the same techniques. They manipulate what is recorded, what is celebrated, and what is hidden. They engineer memory, craft narratives, and dictate perception. The White House is not merely a historical example, it is a blueprint. It is proof that those in power understand the weaponization of omission, and that they will maintain it for as long as the structure, the story, and the system remain unchallenged. Now, take a moment. Reflect. You have descended into the machinery of concealment, witnessed the buried names, the hidden deaths, the carved stones. And you are beginning to see how institutions shape reality through deliberate omission. Now, we step into the territory where history, psychology, and power converge, the point where concealment becomes control, and control becomes culture. The White House is not merely a building of stone and wood, it is a repository of methodology, a carefully orchestrated template for shaping perception and managing memory. Every erased name, every ledger substitution, every stone turned inward is a lesson in obedience and compliance. It is a demonstration of how systems of authority train people, workers, citizens, historians alike, to accept gaps, to rationalize absence, to see only what power allows them to see. Think about the implications. When the names of men and women are replaced with numbers or vague descriptors, when the sick are moved to hidden sheds, when carved initials are turned inward to be invisible, something subtle but profound happens. A culture of invisibility takes root. Those in power begin to understand that erasure can be more effective than punishment, that shaping memory can be more powerful than legislation. By controlling what is remembered, and what is deliberately forgotten, they craft a narrative that justifies itself while concealing its cost. This is why the hidden chamber, discovered during the Truman Reconstruction, is so significant. It was not a mistake. It was a continuation of a strategy that began in 1792, a physical manifestation of the system that sought to preserve authority by hiding human suffering. Every bone fragment, every artifact, every tool or piece of fabric is evidence that the machinery of control is precise, intentional, and enduring. Those who built the White House understood the limits of force. They understood that power is maintained not merely by commands or laws, but by shaping perception, normalizing absence, and conditioning the populace to accept incompleteness as reality. And yet, the resistance persists. The carved stones, the subtle initials, the traces preserved by those who refuse to vanish entirely, they are reminders that truth can never be fully erased. History itself conspires to return, to whisper through cracks in the wall, to speak through fragments and forgotten records. Even when institutions act to contain it, the evidence endures, waiting for someone to recognize its significance. By understanding this, you are beginning to see the mechanics of influence at the deepest level. The White House is not just a symbol of democracy, it is a study in how authority perpetuates itself, how systems manufacture compliance, and how memory can be weaponized. And as you descend further, you will see that the lessons buried there extend far beyond bricks and mortar. They reach into the structures of modern power itself. Now we approach the most unsettling layer, the point where human suffering, systemic erasure, and institutional power intersect to form a pattern that repeats across time. By the mid-20th century, those working inside the White House, even without complete historical context, began to sense the weight of what they were uncovering. The carved stones, the hidden chamber, the skeletal remains, all of it was a testament not merely to forgotten lives, but to a deliberate methodology of concealment and control. What began as physical erasure in the 1790s had evolved into a psychological framework for authority, a template in which truth is not denied through lies, but through selective omission. Consider the implications. The original commissioners replaced the names of enslaved men and women with generic descriptors. Sick workers were moved to isolated sheds. Those who died were replaced, their absence recorded as a logistical inconvenience rather than human loss. The carvings in stone, subtle as they were, became acts of defiance against this system. They were tiny threads of memory stitched into a fabric of silence, symbols meant to survive erasure. And they did survive. Over a century later, they resurfaced during renovations, exposing the deliberate strategies of control that had long been hidden in plain sight. The chamber discovered during the Truman Reconstruction is the clearest example. Hidden from every official record, it contained the physical evidence of what the government preferred to ignore, human suffering that could not be reconciled with the myth of a nation built on freedom. This was not oversight, it was policy. Every layer of concealment, from ledger entries to hidden stones to buried chambers, served a singular purpose: to maintain the narrative of authority while erasing the human cost that threatened its legitimacy. And here is where it becomes relevant to you. Recognizing this system is not passive observation, it is awakening. The White House, in its concealed corners and hidden histories, is a mirror of every institution, every system, every hierarchy that has ever depended on selective memory to preserve power. The methods have evolved, but the principle remains the same. Control is maintained not only by force, but by shaping perception, normalizing omission, and ensuring that those who suffer in silence remain invisible to the story everyone else is told. You have descended far enough now to understand that history is not neutral. It is curated, it is crafted, and it is weaponized. Those hidden stones, those forgotten lives, and those buried chambers are proof that power is maintained by controlling what is remembered, and what is deliberately forgotten. Now we reach the threshold where the weight of understanding becomes almost unbearable, the realization that the White House, that symbol of democracy and freedom, was constructed atop not just labor, but deliberate erasure. The hidden stones, the carved initials, the secret chamber, all are evidence that those in power understood a principle as old as civilization itself: control is absolute when you determine what is seen and what is concealed. And the cost of that control is human life, systematically reduced to an absence so complete that history itself forgets. Look closer. Each act of concealment was a lesson in obedience, not just for the workers on the construction site, but for the generations that would inherit the narrative. Replace a man's name with a ledger entry. Turn a carved stone inward. Hide the sick and dying in a shed. Erase every trace of the individuals whose sweat and blood built the nation's most iconic house. This is more than history. This is an instruction in power, the silent architecture of dominance. Those who designed and maintained these systems knew that perception could be molded as effectively as law. They understood that a name remembered could survive oppression, but a name erased could vanish from the collective consciousness forever. The more we dig, the clearer the pattern becomes. Every institution, every bureaucracy, every hierarchy that thrives on authority follows the same blueprint. Omit inconvenient truths. Replace personal histories with generic labels. Transform suffering into abstract data. Normalize absence. It is subtle, insidious, and incredibly effective. And yet, as the discoveries of 1901, 1948, and 1950 reveal, truth refuses to vanish entirely. It surfaces in whispers, in diaries, in carvings that no one intended to be found. Human resilience defies even the most sophisticated systems of control. And now you are seeing it, not as a story, not as an abstract concept, but as a framework. A framework that stretches from the foundations of the White House to every institution that relies on selective memory to preserve power. Understanding this is dangerous. It changes how you perceive authority, history, and the narratives presented as truth. You are no longer a passive observer. You are awake to the mechanisms that shape reality itself. The descent is nearly complete. One final layer remains, the revelation that connects the hidden labor, the buried names, and the secret stones to the invisible network of influence that persists today. This is the layer most are never allowed to see here. At the culmination of our descent, we confront the ultimate truth: the White House is more than a building, more than a residence, more than a symbol. It is a living archive of power, an enduring blueprint for the control of memory, perception, and human consciousness. Every hidden stone, every erased name, every buried chamber, every ledger entry that reduced a person to a number or a generic label, they are all part of a deliberate strategy, a system designed to preserve authority at the expense of reality. And the lessons of that system extend far beyond the walls of Washington. Look closely. The concealment of enslaved laborers, their deaths, and their contributions was not merely a historical atrocity, it was a mechanism of control. By erasing them from the official record, those in power ensured that the narrative of the nation could be shaped to serve the few, while the many remained invisible. Their lives became a footnote, a ghost, a void in the collective consciousness. Yet, the carved stones, the hidden chamber, and the fragments that survived are proof that truth cannot be fully erased. Memory persists, even when institutions try to crush it, and resistance survives in the smallest, most defiant acts. This is the pattern. Conceal what is inconvenient. Normalize the absence of evidence. Shape perception so that the erasure itself becomes invisible. And in doing so, craft a reality that serves those in control. The White House is the prototype, but the method repeats everywhere, every institution, every system, every hierarchy that relies on selective memory, omission, and carefully curated narratives to preserve authority. It is the silent architecture of dominance, invisible to the untrained eye but as real and as lethal as any overt oppression. And now, as you absorb this, you must recognize your position. You have witnessed the hidden chains, traced the erased lives, and seen the methods by which power manipulates reality. You are no longer a passive observer, you are awakened. The knowledge you now carry is dangerous because it cannot be unseen. It changes your perception of history, institutions, and authority itself. It demands vigilance, awareness, and discernment. Remember this: systems of power rely on forgetting, on erasure, on silence. But every act of observation, every acknowledgement of the hidden, every recognition of what was deliberately concealed, is a small act of defiance. You have descended into the forbidden, and you have emerged with knowledge that transforms. This is the truth they never wanted you to see. The White House's hidden chains are real. The people who built it, and were buried beneath it, are real. And the lessons they left, carved into stone and shadow, are yours to hold. The descent is complete. The awakening begins.